Hello everyone. More than 30 million people around the world got infected by the novel coronavirus and 950,000 people died because of this virus. In the Southern Hemisphere, Australia started facing the second wave of the pandemic. My guest today is Eda Seyhan. She lives in Melbourne, Australia. She is a human rights lawyer. With her, we will talk about Australia's fight against the coronavirus, and we may also learn from her what might be awaiting us, those countries in the Northern Hemisphere, I mean. Welcome, Eda.
Thank you for having me on.
Let me start by asking you about the recent situation in Melbourne. The state of Victoria has become the epicenter of the second wave of the pandemic in the country. At the beginning of August, a curfew was announced. It was supposed to come to an end 6 weeks later, but you are still staying indoors at the moment, and we are halfway through September already. And what can you tell us about the atmosphere in Melbourne at the moment?
So currently Melbourne is under quite a hard lockdown. We're only allowed to leave our house for 4 reasons. That's exercise, work, health and care, and shopping for essential items. As you said, there's a 9 p.m. curfew. We're not allowed to leave the city of Melbourne right now. Most workplaces and shops are closed. So it is quite a hard lockdown at the moment. And as you said, Victoria is experiencing its second wave. So actually the second wave has been much more severe than the first. We had a peak in about early August of 700 approximately cases per day. That's luckily come down to 45, so that is good, and people I think are feeling a bit more hopeful. But I would say that in general, the feeling is one of, people are tired of the lockdown. We had really a very short period of easing of restrictions in May and early June, but that was, only an easing of restrictions, and we've been under some form of restrictions for about 6 months now. So it is long, and it is, it's people are definitely feeling a bit tired of it. But I think it's important to make it clear to your viewers that actually Victoria is in a very different situation to the rest of Australia. Most of the states in Australia have actually eliminated the virus almost entirely, or they have a very small number of the virus. And in general, Australia has done quite well in terms of its numbers. We've had approximately I think less than 1,000 deaths overall. So that's, something that's quite relatively good compared to comparable countries. In general, the response has been quite science-led, it seems. Politicians have not, like in some other countries, doubted the severity of the virus or doubted the science. It's been very easy to get tested. I myself got tested quite recently. A drive-in centre 15 minutes from my house, completely free, and I got the results the next day. So in some ways the response has been quite good, but there have also been kind of serious issues with the response as well, I would say.
I would like to ask you also about the implementation of those measures taken against the pandemic, because as you also wrote in your recent article for Al Jazeera, as a human rights lawyer, you draw attention to the high level of use of force by law enforcement officials in the country. Could you tell us a bit more about what is going on with the implementation of the measures, particularly in the state of Victoria?
So yeah, I guess Australia is a lot like other countries in that the response to the virus has been sort of police and enforcement led rather than public health and care led. So we see, just like in response to any issue, whether it's terrorism or domestic violence or a virus, the response that governments take is just giving the police more powers and increasing policing. In Australia, that has meant a state of emergency since the pandemic began. And in Victoria, we've seen police issue over 20,000 fines in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And the cheapest of those fines is $1,600. That's about 8,000 Turkish lira, so it's not an insignificant amount of money. And I think what's most worrying is the fact that it's the same groups who are routinely over-policed being again disproportionately targeted with COVID-19 related police powers. So in Australia, that's poor people, that's Indigenous people, that's ethnic minorities, mostly black and brown people being targeted with COVID-19 related infringements, fines essentially. And there's a few examples of that. I mean, in Sydney, in around April, there were figures released that showed that 33% of fines were issued in a very small number of southwest Sydney neighbourhoods where the population is mostly Indigenous or ethnic minority or low income. In Melbourne, we had a very serious case where 9 public housing towers, whose residents include a lot of refugees, a lot of migrants, a lot of people from our own Turkish community as well, being placed under a heavy militarized lockdown. So you had the 3,000 residents of those public housing towers essentially trapped in their homes with 500 police stationed outside the towers. So, you know, a response that we did not see in the mostly white, rich neighborhoods in other parts of Melbourne. So I think that's something that's been very worrying. I think one other aspect that's been worrying is the policing of protests. So we've seen, for example, quite recently in Sydney, a protest at a university where student protesters were given fines under COVID regulations, and one of the students was arrested. While at the same time in Sydney, you've got sports events with 1,000 people attending and no policing of those. So there's a difference there that's very worrying. In Melbourne as well, actually quite near where I live, there was a protest in support of detained refugees, which was done where the protesters did the protest in cars. So in a way that is very much safe in terms of COVID, you know, very socially distanced. But even then, the police targeted that protest. The organisers were charged with a criminal offence. Those who attended were given fines. So we do see a kind of policing of protests that I think is quite worrying. And I think it's also important to note that a lot of people might think that these are temporary powers, right? The police get given extra powers for a state of emergency to deal with the virus, and those will, you know, end with the end of the pandemic. But unfortunately, that is rarely the case. When you give police more power, they tend to like it, they tend to use it, and they don't want to give it up. And that has been the case here in Victoria. We have just at this very moment, the government proposed a new law to expand the powers of not quite the police, but a section of law enforcement that generally have lesser powers than the police. And essentially what they're trying to do is ramp up the powers of that group. They're called PSOs. And by doing that, pretty much expand the police force. And that's something that will last beyond the pandemic. So they're essentially exploiting the virus in order to pretty much ramp up, you know, the repressive powers of the state. So I think that's something that's very worrying and sort of needs to be paid attention to.
Australia also has a big and strong economy. If we look at the economic aspect, or many countries were hardly damaged because of the pandemic, like economies couldn't function. There were some steps taken to help people get through these difficult times in Australia as well. Could you provide some insight into the details of these packages, help provided, the assistance provided by the government for the people?
Yeah, so as you said, Australia is quite a rich country. It's a highly advanced capitalist economy, and it has pretty much used its resources to spend big and spend fast in response to the pandemic. So the government has introduced a fiscal stimulus of around 200 billion Australian dollars. It's about 10% of the Australian GDP. So it's a very large amount, and it's actually one of the biggest of all the fiscal stimuluses around the world. So they have spent a lot of money, and a big part of that has been what's called the JobKeeper program. That's a wage subsidy program for businesses that have lost revenue due to the pandemic. And the employees of those businesses get $750 per week from the government via their employer, which is a not insignificant amount. It's not a huge amount of money, but it is a not insignificant amount of money at the same time. And in addition to that, those who are already getting government benefits, so pensioners, single parents, carers, they've also seen an increase in their welfare benefits. I think the most important kind of exclusion from these programs has been temporary visa holders, so kind of temporary migrant workers, and international students. So that's not a very small segment of the population. It's about 1 million people in Australia, and Australia's population is about 25 million. So, you know, it's a pretty sizable segment of the population, and they're not eligible for JobKeeper. They're not eligible for the other government benefits. So they've essentially been excluded from any help during the pandemic. And actually, Australia is distinct from other countries. There are other countries like Ireland and Canada who have included those groups in their fiscal stimulus. Whereas the response in Australia, our Prime Minister came out and said they should go home, essentially. And we're talking about people who've lived here for many years, and a situation where borders are closed, flights are extremely expensive. A lot of people cannot simply go home. So we have seen quite an increase in hardship for those groups. There was a report that recently came out that said 1 in 7 have been made homeless, and that around 30% have had to rely on or have been unable to pay for food. So, you know, that's quite shocking in a very rich country. And actually in Melbourne, if you go into the city, you know, on a Sunday, you will see often long lines of international students queuing for food from charities and churches. And there has been, you know, a big, you know, push from a lot of charities, and also within the Turkish community here, there are a lot of Turkish international students. And we know individually, we know people who have lost their jobs and have suffered as a result of the pandemic and have not been given government help. So, you know, it has affected quite a lot of people here. And I think that's something that is very worrying, that segment of the population has essentially been excluded from any kind of help.
Yes, it seems like a large portion of the population is excluded in the end, as you mentioned. And at the beginning, when we talked about law enforcement, you also mentioned peaceful protests, people going out into streets. We also talked about it, but I want to hear it from you again. Were these groups included in these protests? Can we say that after these lockdowns and being excluded from the economic or fiscal benefits, did they do something to raise their voice, and how was the reaction from those communities or the people?
Yeah, so we haven't seen, I guess, that many protests specifically from temporary visa holders or international students, but we have seen, I think, a reaction against the wider problem of insecure work and casual work. I think specifically with the second wave of the virus in Victoria, the vast majority of people who've got sick from COVID-19 during the second wave caught that illness at work. So in Victoria, more than maybe anywhere else, it's very clear that this is a plague of the working class. People like me who work from home, lawyers, professionals who have secure work and the privilege of working from home, don't have to go out and risk getting the virus or risk losing their job. But low-wage people in insecure work, and that includes a lot of international students, a lot of temporary visa holders, they're the ones who've been forced out to really work or risk losing their livelihoods. And I think, so that's kind of the industries where people have been getting the virus are those where insecure work is very high, where the labour force is very casualised, and also where, you know, union power is very weak, where employers have relied on easily exploitable migrant labour. So those are the industries where we're seeing kind of the virus spread. And the worst of all right now in Victoria is the aged care sector. So sadly, most of the deaths that have occurred in Victoria are residents, so elderly people who are in nursing homes or aged care facilities. And it's, I think, important to note that most of those have occurred in private aged care facilities, so not in public government-run nursing homes. So in some ways, the virus has kind of exposed the inadequacy and the failures of two central aspects of neoliberalism: privatization of public services and the casualization of the workforce. The fact that most people do not work like me, they work in ways that are insecure, where they work from shift to shift and have no guarantee of a wage if they don't show up to work. But your question was more about kind of responses to that, and I think there's been sort of two, I'd say, responses, one good and one bad. Starting with the good, there has been an increase in kind of union activism. We've seen, especially in warehouses, essential industries, we've seen kind of workers take action to protect themselves from the virus. There was one case quite recently, a large multinational company called Toll. They have a huge number of warehouses across Melbourne. In one of their warehouses, where they have 300 workers, and most of those are casual workers, insecure workers, one of them caught the virus. The employers refused to tell the workers who had caught the virus, where they worked, and they refused to take the appropriate actions to ensure that, you know, the workplace was safe. So the union kind of mobilized against that, managed to get an order that said the workplace was not safe, that, you know, it needed to be clean, that workers should go home. But despite that order, the employer, the bosses, tried to force the casualized workforce to stay and to keep working, physically blocking the doors, threatening them with losing their jobs. So, you know, you've got these workers who are particularly vulnerable to getting the virus being forced to continue working, even in a workplace where the virus has, you know, spread. So that in that instance, the union was successful, and there have been quite a few similar cases of kind of activism of that kind. And it's not just been at the kind of grassroots level. Even the Premier of Victoria, that's, you know, our head of state at the state level, has said that insecure work is an issue, and that the virus has exposed that. So even at the highest levels of government, there's finally a recognition that the casualization of the workforce is an issue. That's the good, I'd say, the good part. The negative part, the bad part, is the fact that you have at the same time a reaction to the lockdown itself coming from mostly kind of working class migrant neighbourhoods. So there have been quite a few protests against the lockdown in those neighbourhoods, and it's quite different to the protests happening in the US or Germany, where it's mostly kind of right-wing conspiracy theorists, middle-class white people. Here we're talking about mostly young men, low income, in neighbourhoods that are actually the neighbourhoods in Melbourne known for their Turkish and Arab populations, migrant populations. So you see those groups also kind of self-organising and protesting against the virus. Unfortunately, some of them do believe in the conspiracy theories, you know, they're against the lockdown because of that. But at the same time, a lot of them are just simply frustrated at losing their jobs, frustrated at losing their livelihoods. And I think it's unfortunate that that kind of mass of working class anger and frustration is being leveled against the lockdown, and occasionally, you know, villains like Bill Gates or George Soros, these kind of supposed evildoers, rather than, you know, the root causes of people's alienation, capitalism, neoliberalism, insecure work. So I think that's kind of a fairly worrying development, that you see groups who might in the past have been involved in community groups or unions, and you know, that anger, that frustration might have been directed towards politically useful activism. Now it's being directed towards false villains, George Soros or whoever it is, according to Facebook that day. So I would say that's quite a negative development, and in some ways it's you know, it's those twin kind of forces of neoliberalism. It's the insecure work, and then it's people, individualism, lack of political education. So, you know, working class people being misdirected towards kind of conspiracy theories. So yeah, those are two kind of interesting responses that I think are quite specific to Victoria, or even specific to Melbourne.
Thank you so much for your sparing your time and being here for this interview and joining me. It was my pleasure to talk to you.
Thanks so much for having me and for inviting me on. Thank you.
And thank you all for watching us. Stay tuned for more content from Medyascope.